Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 20th Annual Brattleboro Literary Festival. I'm Chard deNiord, Poetry Coordinator for the festival. We're excited today to present four award-winning poets to our panel, Jane Hirshfield, Shanta Lee Gander, Diana Whitney, and Vijay Seshadri. You can submit questions to our panelists via the question and answer button on your screen. If your question has already been submitted, please click the thumbs up icon to vote the question. There will also be links in the chat to purchase their books and donate to the festival. And finally, I want to extend a special thank you to our sponsors. I'm going to introduce our panelists today. Welcome, Vijay and Jane and Shanta Lee and Diana. Jane Hirshfield is the author of 9 collections of poetry, including Ledger, The Beauty, longlisted for the National Book Award, Come Thief, a finalist for the PEN USA Poetry Award, and Given Sugar, Given Salt, a finalist for the National Book Critics Award. She's also the author of 2 collections of essays, 9 Gates, Entering the Mind of Poetry, and 10 Windows, How Great Poems Transform the World, and has edited and co-translated 4 books collecting the work of world poets from the past, The Ink Dark Moon, Poems by Ono no Kamachi, and Izumi Shikabu, Women of the Ancient Court of Japan, Women in Praise of the Sacred, 43 Centuries of Spiritual Poetry by Women, Marabi, Ecstatic Poems in the Heart of the Haiku. Jane put aside writing early in her career for nearly 8 years to study at San Francisco Zen Center. I felt that I would never make much of a poet if I didn't know more than I knew at the time about what it means to be a human being, end of quote. She once confessed, I don't think poetry is based just on poetry, it's based on a thoroughly lived life. For the past year, Jane has devoted every day to some civic duty or project, which I hope she will talk more about during our panel discussion. Shanta Lee Gander. Shanta Lee earned an MBA degree from the University of Hartford, an undergraduate degree in women, gender, and sexuality from Trinity College, and an MFA degree in creative nonfiction and poetry from Vermont College of Fine Arts. She gives lectures on the life of Lucy Terry Prince. I should mention that Lucy Terry Prince, an early 18th century, early 18th century and late 17th century poet, right on the cusp there of 1800, was America's first African-American poet, and a historical marker has just been put up in praise and memory of her. And Shanta Lee is a member of the Vermont Humanities Council Speakers Bureau as well. In addition to being a poet with a first book out just recently titled Ghetto Claustrophobia, Dreamin' of Mama While Trying to Speak Woman in Woke Tongues, Shanta has collaborated with fellow writers, business people, and politicians on such socially vital projects as Create Vermont Action Plan. In addition to this work, she has worked tirelessly at implementing the citywide Visioning a Healthier New Haven that includes digital storytelling and data collection. She has curated and launched such important statewide projects as Giving Women the Power Over AIDS, the Healing with Art series, and Nourishing the Inner Artist, Conversations about Art, Creativity, and Imagination. She's the co-author of the I Am exhibition in collaboration with the Vermont Arts Council, and is the co-author with her husband, McLean Gander, of Ghost of Cuba, an interracial couple's exploration of Cuba in the age of Trump, told in images and words, which she hopes to publish soon. Diana Whitney writes across genres in Vermont with both a focus on feminism, motherhood, and sexuality. Her first book, Wanting It, became an indie bestseller and won the Rubery Book Award in poetry. She was a longtime poetry critic for the San Francisco Chronicle, where she featured women poets and LGBTQ plus voices in her column. Her essays, op-eds, and book reviews have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Kenyon Review, Glamour, and many more. Her anthology, You Don't Have to Be Everything, Poems for Girls Becoming Themselves, was released by Workman Publishing and to critical acclaim, and became a YA bestseller this past year. Diana was awarded a 2020 2021-22 creation grant from Vermont Arts Council for a new collection about girls, rape, culture, and excavating female adolescence. She has also received grants and awards from Sustainable Arts Foundation, the Women's National Book Association, Vermont Arts Endowment, Virginia Center for the Arts, and the Vermont Studio Center. She holds a BA from Dartmouth and an MA from Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar and attended the Warren Wilson MFA program. Diane also works as a feminist activist in her community and beyond. Her advocacy for survivors of sexual violence has been featured in the New York Times, the Globe, Boston Globe, and the Christian Science Monitor. She is represented by Elisa Demona at Writers House. Vijay Seshadri, poet, essayist and critic. Vijay came to the US from India with his family at the age of 5. He earned a BA from Oberlin College and an MFA from Columbia. He is the author of Wild Kingdom, The Long Meadow, which won the James Laughlin Award, Disappearances, 3 Sections, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2013, and most recently, That Was Now, This Is Then, published in 2020. In addition to having written award-winning poetry, Vijay has also written some of America's best essays and reviews on poetry over the years and worked as an editor at the Paris Review, the New York, and the New Yorker. He directs the MFA program at Sarah Lawrence and lives in Brooklyn with his wife and son. Wish I could say a lot more about all of you, but we need the time to talk today about writing in the time of the pandemic. So I think I will just start by asking the question, what has this been like for each of you? And I think that, you know, your responses will certainly reverberate with many who are also trying to write creatively, specifically poetry during this time. So Jane, would you like to be first up in answering that question?
Well, I will try to answer briefly because otherwise I would take too much time. So I suppose the best way to describe this sort of combination of shock and something that in fact is very close to my own nature is by saying that I surprised both myself and an NPR interviewer in April 2020 when she asked me, you know, as the opening to our brief conversation on the air, she said, well, how are you? And what I said was, well, you know, poets are actually fairly well prepared for pandemics. And I heard her absolutely shocked silence because it was not what she was expecting to hear. But I am very used to crisis. I am used to facing into abyss. This was a new abyss, but we had been before that in quite a few years of crisis and abyss. And so, you know, to stay home and feel sharply and think deeply was what I want to do when something terrible happens. And I suppose, you know, on the more outer practical level, I had a book, my book Ledger was published on March 10th, 2020. That is literally the day that in this country, the world changed. That was the day that every venue that I had been going on book tour for after the first 3 started getting in touch about canceling everything. I came home, I read in New York at the 92nd Street Y, I read in Chicago for the Poetry Foundation, both were filled. I went to Seattle to read at Elliott Bay, and there was, you know, 15 foolish people in spaced apart chairs in a venue that had been hand disinfected by the store owner. And when I came home, I put myself into quarantine because I had been in Seattle, which was the first known epicenter. It was, of course, in other places, but we didn't know that yet. And a few days later, after I had put myself into quarantine anyhow, the whole Bay Area went into shelter at home. We were the first geographic area of the country to institute that. And that first day when suddenly the whole world joined me in staying home in silence and sequestration, it was audibly different. It was a bit like 9/11. You know, there was no traffic sounds. There were even fewer airplanes. And that morning, I had been sort of, at odds and scattered and dealing with all of the book things and continuing some of the written correspondences. And suddenly the fullness of it entered my household and my psyche. And I saw a little ant crossing my computer. And I wrote a poem, which I can read you, but I think I won't read now. I hope there'll be a chance to read it later. But I wrote a poem about doing nothing, and that the only way I could serve my fellow beings and community was in fact by doing nothing, except I took the ant back outside to give it a little chance to live.
Yeah.
And the poem was published, almost instantly. The San Francisco Chronicle called me up, said, "Do you have anything?" And I said, "Well, oddly, I do." Went viral immediately because it was probably one of the first of the pandemic poems to go out in public. And that sort of set the tone for all the ensuing months. This combination of being both silenced and being called on to speak, and navigating with everybody else and alone what our shared fate had brought us to. That's enough for now. I'm sorry, that was already too long.
Jane, that was great. I'm so thankful this panel is being recorded, because people will be able to go back and hear all of these wonderful answers, and we'll certainly reserve enough time for you to read that. Let's just go through the panel here and get some quick responses to that question. Anybody like to go next, or do you want me to call on you? Shanta, you want to go?
Sure. It was funny because I was thinking, I was of a couple of minds when the pandemic hit. I was thinking, what a reminder it was of what I was taught about the lack of safety growing up Black in America. It reminded me that spaces and other people were always unsafe, and it launched me more into doing more digging. I dove deeper into other book projects, but also it was the first time that I felt like racism was also represented or seen as like the other pandemic that's been going on before COVID. It also was a reminder of stark class divisions. There was a bit of sadness I felt, because I felt like for the first time, we all were forced to see the unseen in ways that we don't in the so-called normal times. And I'll just wrap by saying, one of the other things that made me feel, I was of two minds of feeling incredibly lucky and like taking a break from racism by being home, even though I had to be home anyway before the pandemic, and writing and focus. But also I was thinking, wow, of course in America, even during a pandemic, we're placed into more hierarchy with the Zoom elite versus those who still have to go to work and risk their lives. And so those were some of the very complicated things for me that still continues to go through my mind, especially if things open and who still gets to travel and be places and leave footprints.
Thank you, Shanta.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Diana? No?
Yeah, thanks, Shanta. I also want to, those ideas of the inequalities that were just dramatically revealed by the pandemic, some of which were already there, but were laid bare. And, I remember pretty early on there, there's a lot of social media around, like, now I'm going to write my novel because I'm just here. And there were people who wrote books in the pandemic, like whole books, and now they're already published. And I honor them and I bow down to them. And let me say, that was not me. I think anybody, certainly the people who are essential workers and who had to keep going, whether they were on the front lines and within the medical community or working in businesses in person that didn't close, but also parents and particularly mothers, those of us who've had children at home. There was there was not a lot of like being able to go into like the silence and the inner life. For me, being home with teenagers, there's a great mental health crisis that happened, and we're still reckoning with. And I actually just looked up some statistics, like even from this August, I think like 56% of teens like between 11 and 18 have had suicidal ideation and like severe depression. And that's something that I experienced here in my house, both with, I have two daughters, both of them in the isolation. And so I guess one of my own lessons has been around poetry. And I'm not saying I didn't write poetry because I did. And I would like to share, like, I want to hear the ant poem, and then I do want to share one that I did manage to write. But the absolute, the sort of quiet going into the unconscious, at least last year, as things have shifted now, but within the sort of collective trauma and what was going on with our nervous systems in response to the lockdown and the fear, the kind of mortal fear that we were going on. For me, that wasn't a fruitful time for the immersion into poetry, and I had to forgive myself. And I had to read the viral poems of others with great appreciation, and then also know that it wasn't my time, and that what I was doing in the caregiving work that I had to do was like the primary work. I'm also an advocate for survivors of sexual assault, and so some of that advocacy work that became more immediate within the pandemic as well.
Thank you, Diana. Vijay, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, like everything else in my life, the pandemic was a New York story for me.
Mm-hmm.
My wife and I live in Brooklyn, and her father lives alone in Manhattan. And when the pandemic hit, he had caregivers, but we had to send them away. And she went there to take care of him, and I was providing outside support, and he lives off First Avenue. And those of you who know the city know that on the east side, there are a bunch of hospitals. The closest one to them is New York Hospital. And the city was completely empty, of course. All the people who could, the rich, and the social element is defined for me by the rich versus the poor. They'd all emptied out, and the rest of us were left here in a state of terror about touching anything. There's a kind of, in object relations therapy, there's a concept known as skin ego, that yourself is actually not located in some Cartesian center of the skull, but is sort of extends outward from your skin in some way. And the isolation was severe in that way. And it made me realize how pregnant and rich that concept is, that what we call ourselves extends outward in all sorts of ways and is located somewhere between our bodies and the world. And what I remember of that early period is, of course, as all of you know, New York was hit tremendously hard. We were the epicenter in America because of the subways, because of the structure of the city. And I would be shopping for them. My wife would be taking care of her father, and then I'd be alone in Brooklyn, and I was driving because I was afraid to get on the subways. So, and the streets were nice and empty. I mean, it was like 9/11 in that way. And it was the strangest time. And I have to say, in terms of poetry, that time was really too strange for me to really encompass it. And only retrospectively can I imagine rendering it with the clarity it deserves, with the proper images and the kind of concentration that would bring that experience to life. And, you know, and I very much associated myself with those people who were the frontline people. I mean, food was being delivered everywhere in the city, and there were those people who delivered, there were those frontline workers, and, you know, and so many of them in New York are Hispanic, right? And so many of them are kind of undocumented and immigrants, and you know, so there was a kind of, in terms of social bonding, that was the fundamental awareness. In terms of like my experience, it was of an intense physical and existential isolation, you know, of the sort that I'd never known. And I realized, I mean, what it's like to actually not have another animal sleeping beside you in bed. I'd gotten so used to that for so long, you know, another human animal. And it's that isolation has continued. I'm living alone in Brooklyn. My wife is still, you know, in Manhattan. You know, she comes back here once in a while. We see each other. We always have dinner, but you know, that you know, made me realize that isolation is very concrete. It's not poetic. It's just,
No.
you know, it's really animal. It's this animal thing, you know, this. But
Thank you all for your wonderful responses to this. I'm just realizing as you talk, Vijay, that, you know, that as poets during normal times with quotes around it, we you know, we think about a readership, we think about the luxury of thinking about art and literature. But during the pandemic, people are thinking about something else in a way that just you know, distracts them from their normal activity, especially maybe their intellectual and creative activity. So the whole question of, well, who are you writing for, and who's going to be listening to this poem about a walnut, or, you know, anything else besides the singular subject of the plague, especially during the beginning of COVID. So I just wonder if writing in that isolation, as you put it, Vijay, affected the actual content of your work. I mean, you feeling like maybe you were the only audience of your own work, and what kind of reflexive effect did that have on just writing, period?
should I start?
Sure.
I think what happened to me is that I turned to prose, and I turned to those aspects of prose. I turned to the material that I have a command of that is in some sense extreme. So I'm writing right now about Bangladesh, and, you know, I'd written earlier about material having to do with the partition of British India, you know, things that have a lot of, you know, starkness and affliction associated with them.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, and it never occurred to me to write poems about that material. And because I don't think that material can be accommodated, at least in my mind, at least given the kind of poet I am. And I tend to be a dark poet in a lot of ways, you know, but, you know, I would never approach that material with poetry. And I've reflected on this a little bit, and it strikes me that two things the pandemic did for me is that it gave me, because although I was teaching on Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
So I was basically sitting in front of the screen that I am sitting in front of now,
Mm-hmm.
or since, you know, the middle of March 2020. And so that kind of thing is helpful to the writing of prose, because, you know, there's a lot of the equivalent of manual labor involved in writing prose. And you really need to not have somewhere to go in order to work, or I need to. And,
That's true.
you know. And also, I mean, I think the idea of extreme experience, you know, and I guess I mean extreme in a negative way,
Mhm.
was something that was easier for me to sit with and live with, probably because of the strangeness of this period, and, you know, and the starkness of it,
Mhm.
and what Shanta called the lack of safety.
Mhm.
The idea that somehow the world is charged with danger, you know, and the
Mhm.
danger is so intimate, you know, it's someone breathing on you, someone, you know,
Mhm.
some surface that you touch, you know, initially.
Mhm.
So yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you, EJ. We'll come back to this subject. Jane, with you. Jane, you mentioned that for the past year or maybe longer, you've been engaged almost daily in some sort of civic enterprise or duty, I think, as you mentioned yesterday. I don't want to misrepresent, but I wonder if you could talk about what some of those enterprises have been and how maybe they've affected you during this time and your
Well,
writing.
for those who weren't at yesterday's reading with Ed Hirsch, what I said was I've actually taken some action every day since the election of 2016. From
Okay,
that
date.
night,
Yeah.
when, you know, I entered a sense of crisis. You know, by 5 o'clock on the West Coast that evening, it was pretty clear what was going to happen.
Mhm.
And I went into a sense of emergency then, which, you know, has still not ended. And so I took up from that moment the practice of doing something every day, which would feel like, you know, anything from whenever I was speaking in public to the most trivial, inconsequential, and futile of actions like signing a petition. You know, it became very clear after a while that signing a petition was simply a way for organizations to then ask you for a donation because you were moving in an engaged way. And so you would be more likely to give.
Mhm.
And I didn't care what was futile. I didn't care. I simply felt it was upon me to respond in some way every day to the sense that the world needed repair. And there's no separation for me between the crisis of how we human beings are choosing to be with each other on the earth at this moment and the crisis of the pandemic. If anything, it simply makes clearer, you know, the great Buddhist truths of interdependence, which Vijay refers to when he talked about door delivery. You know, I've never had anything delivered here the whole time. I simply masked up and went out, taking advantage of the offer of the senior hours when stores were less crowded because I qualify. But you know, what we have seen with this pandemic is a truth very dear to my heart for the past many decades, which is held for me under this phrase of shared fate. Our lives are interdependent and interconnected, and nothing shows you that more than a virus does. And so in some small way, every day, I have taken some action which had a tiny bit of public resonance or a larger bit of public resonance and offered my own molecule on the tiller of how we live together, hoping to move it towards a direction of compassion, tenderness, and seeing clearly what is going on. And, you know, rarely I'm able to do it as a poet, but I was all, you know, a small donation, you know, whether the donation is to The Guardian for their excellent news coverage or to a direct action group. The only time in that whole year that I did a public event was after George Floyd's death, when I put on my mask and went to a march. And it just felt important. And nobody was counting the march in my hometown. Nobody was looking at who was on the streets in Mill Valley, but I could not stay home. And so I did not stay home. So the full range. Yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful answer.
It's interesting.
Diana, yes, go ahead.
No, I just that there were definitely throughout 2020 these shared moments. I also remember that first march that I went to in May of 2020 here in Brattleboro, and the strangeness, like the absolute the knowledge that I had to go and be there and masked up, but also the strangeness of leaving the shelter in place and seeing other people, and I guess there was something in the sort of racial rupture and reckoning and trauma of last summer, and then that was one of the phases of the pandemic. There was the quarantine, and then there was the leaving our homes and to bear witness or to march and protest. If we did that, it was actually very energizing to feel that. I remember looking around at people I hadn't seen for months, and there they were on the streets masked, and then looking at the pictures from New York and being amazed. And I think, I don't know if I read a lot of poems, for example, about that. And I think, Vijay, you're right that there's certain things that can only be captured in prose. And so maybe I was reading opinion pieces and essays about specifically what was happening last summer. Shanta, I don't know if you were writing either poetry or prose during that time.
Actually, I did both. So I'm a journalist. I do prose, I do poetry, and I'm a photographer. And so there are a couple of things that happened in terms of I'm thinking of taking action, and I'm thinking, wow, in some cases I became more radical and clearer about my boundaries and how I care for myself. And driving, for example, I had to still drive around certain parts of Vermont. And then every time, that visceral feeling I got when I saw an American flag or a Confederate flag, and thinking, okay, I don't think I'm safe here. And becoming sharper about self-care, and also trying to do what I could, that I did anyway before the pandemic, but even more so, shipping things to relatives who, one did catch COVID twice, and shipping, so, she wouldn't have to leave her home, and thinking about, okay, what is important to keep myself safe? Because this is just reminding me of all the ways that my parents raised me, that I just really had to be careful in a largely white society, white spaces, and ways that I just didn't want to own or admit to until, I'm looking at it. And in terms of response and thinking about it, I did a lot of writing. I kept the pandemic journal that everybody, I guess started, but I really used it as an opportunity to dive into all the ways that we were always telling ourselves stories about a moment of dystopia. And now that dystopia was here, what did that look like? And so I kind of bounced between my expression that came through prose, that came through thinking about the traveled Black body for my second poetry collection that I did finish, and only diving deeper into that, and also an opportunity that had me literally going outside, because it's how I shoot, it's how I do my photography, and all these different ways that I was being both external but very internal, and thinking about how do I keep myself safe, and how do I help keep others safe who are not safe and unseen, and at the same time, how can I use my voice? Is there space for me to use my voice, especially in all the conversations about publishing and who gets to take up space and who doesn't? So all those things are kind of swirling around in some kind of weird kind of soup.
Shanta, just to follow up on that for a second, just to think about this question in a local way. There's been an increased there've been increased cases of racism in Vermont recently, especially in the schools, and here in Brattleboro, even in northern Vermont, where athletes have been accosted. I don't know if you've heard about this. In a lot of the schools, and the principals are saying, well, this is the result of social atrophy. What do you think poets and writers in general can do just locally as far as addressing some of these instances of hostility, a lot of which have, I think, occurred as a result of a TikTok post that occurred encouraging students to act this way. I know that principals are trying to deal with it, but I'm wondering what what poets, what writers can do, and what you feel you might be able to do as well as a social activist, and just addressing the kind of social repercussions of being isolated for almost 2 years. A lot of students are experiencing and re-entering the school system and society in general. What do you feel any hope in, and do you have any ideas on how to maybe address this in a local way?
Funny, because as you were asking that question, my heart just sped up, and I'm just sort of like, okay, I'm not a social activist. I'm not an activist. I give high respect to those who actually own and do that work in that term, in terms of what the role that artists, I'll say artists under, because I do think art, whether we're looking at the language arts or written arts or visual arts or movement arts, I think that, and the humanities, can play a huge role in creating bridges. But I also think that we have to, especially I happen to be in Vermont. I think owning that certain kinds of racism is so invisible that it's insidious. So progressive racism that I've experienced, and thinking about the ways, how do we have that conversation? When is that conversation coming, not just locally, but nationally, around the insidious nature of the racism you cannot see? And so I think that I can't speak for anyone else. I can say for myself, the role I like to play in the world as a citizen of the world is thinking about, how can I be a really good conduit as a journalist in the work that I do for either VPR or whatever I'm doing, especially for voices that aren't always seen or heard. How can I do that? And also, how can I be honest with my truth and myself? I found myself rageful is the word probably, and very taboo, but rage. There is like an undercurrent definitely of some kind of rage, and definitely seen in my second book. It's not, I would say, not really there in the first book. And so in thinking about doing, I feel like the doing also involves the listening as well. I was listening to something on NPR about when individuals are faced with information that challenges their current beliefs, like an MRI scan has shown that they react as if a bear is chasing them. And it's interesting because right now we're like kind of all caps at each other, which is a phrase I'll borrow from a friend. And so the doing, for me, doing, whether you're in the role of like wielding a pen or whatever you will, it can be the listening and being conduit and trying to be present. That's really interesting.
Okay, thank you.
I'm wondering if we could hear some poems now.
I was just going to say, this is where I'm looking at the time. If you folks have a poem to read during the next 20 minutes, that would be wonderful. And I think speak to the larger question that we're discussing here today in a way that's, I think probably will be memorable. So anybody want to begin? Please feel free to step in. Jane, you want to
I'll
start?
start because mine is probably the earliest of them chronologically.
Is this the ant poem, Jane?
Yeah, this is the ant poem.
Okay,
And
great.
I will also just say it speaks to what we have been talking about, in that, the question behind this poem is what can you do when you feel like you can't do anything?
Right.
Or what is possible for us to do under any circumstance? So today when I could do nothing. Today when I could do nothing, I saved an ant. It must have come in with the morning paper, still being delivered to those who shelter in place. A morning paper is still an essential service. I am not an essential service. I have coffee and books, time, a garden, silence enough to fill cisterns. It must have first walked the morning paper as if loosened ink taking the shape of an ant, then across the laptop computer, warm, then onto the back of a cushion. Small black ant, alone, crossing a navy cushion, moving steadily because that is what it could do. Set outside in the sun, it could not have found again its nest. What then did I save? It did not look as if it was frightened, even while walking my hand, which moved it through swiftness and air. Ant, alone, without companions, whose ant heart I could not fathom. How is your life? I wanted to ask. I lifted it, took it outside. This first day when I could do nothing, contribute nothing beyond staying distant from my own kind, I did this.
Thank you, Jane. Wonderful poem. I can see why it went viral.
Ada Limon, who has taken over the curating of the Slowdown, that marvelous project started by Natasha Trethewey when she was poet laureate.
Right.
She just put this poem out this past week as her
fabulous.
As her
Yeah.
meditation and reading.
She's great.
Yeah.
She's wonderful. Anyone want to go next here with a poem? Don't be bashful.
I don't know if, Jane is right about the chronology, but I have a poem.
Okay.
That is titled April 5th, 2020.
Pretty close.
Mine was March 17th.
So you're right about the chronology. And it's, it really addresses the sort of state of mind I was in at that moment. And if you remember, by the time we got to April 5th, it seemed like we'd been in this forever, at least in New York. Mm-hmm. And I kind of felt completely enveloped by it and suffocated. And I think this poem communicates something of the suffocation. April 5th, 2020. Plague thoughts enter the next phase. I just don't want to talk about it. Okay, let's not. Not the stories, the unbearable stories. You have 5 you don't want anymore. You have 15. How did you get so many? Because you live here. Because you identify here. Why do you live here? Why do you live anywhere? Identify anywhere. Because of all these the people, these the mysterious people, the people. Run, says the plague. Some run out, some run in, some can't run. All are comprehended by the plague. Such a beautiful comprehender, such a beautiful talker. eloquent, intelligent, lucid, precise, analytical, graphs, charts, little and big dots across the world. Such a teacher. About ourselves, we are learning so much from you.
Thank you, Vijay. These are such moving poems. I heard a few days ago that 700,000 people in the US have now died from COVID, and which is an overwhelming statistic. And yet, the New York Times actually has done a really reputable job in trying to chronicle the lives of some folks who passed away. But just that number is so overwhelming. It's hard to fathom, and such a poetic challenge to write about it.
Vijay, that the poem with the acknowledgement of the stories that we're holding, I think, I have a friend who's the ICU nurse. So being there to hear her stories, and those of us who've, everyone at this point has lost someone or knows someone who has, so that what it takes to hold those stories, I don't know, but sometimes just that act of listening, which Shanta, that was something that you spoke about too, is, whether they come out in poetry or prose, or whether our bridge building is just to listen to the stories of loss. And I know they now have a memorial in Washington with a flag for every, I don't know if anyone's seen the images of it, the flags waving for each COVID death, but it's a very moving visual image.
Yeah. I mean, there are two elements to it, right? There is, the incredible tragedy of those 700,000 people. And then there's the incredible political horror that so many of those deaths could have been prevented, and the kind of failure of leadership, the breakdown, the sort of indignation we should all be feeling. And the problem with politics ultimately is that we can't sustain in ourselves the kind of indignation we should be feeling at that, I mean, we sort of go back to our normal lives, but when you think about it, it's just amazing. If you go back and remember, not the denial now, the vaccine denial, but the denial then, and it's just, it's
absolutely
like, it's Greek in its fatality for America. I mean, it's just extraordinary. I mean, I think about it and I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say, I mean,
I was just going to say, Vijay, the enormous challenge that we as poets and writers have in general is just simply how to listen and how to witness, I guess is the big word, to a tragedy that none of us have even come close to experiencing before on both a personal and national level. And yet we have to try. I'm reminded of what Seswami said about the importance of immense particulars in poetry, and finding those immense particulars in our elegies and poems about COVID.
I would like to add something that I have not seen much mentioned throughout all of this time, and I think is very important, which is we have actually lived through this before, and we failed to learn the lesson of it before. I recently looked up just to see the global deaths from HIV/AIDS is 39 million.
Yeah.
And, that crisis and the denial and the refusal to face it and the refusal to deal with it and the slowness of our acknowledging that it affected everyone, the putting of it onto a particular community as if the rest of us were immune to it.
Yes.
That is not so different from what has happened with this.
You're exactly right. And I think it's the unfortunate first impulse of a lot of people to say that it is another community, or it is another, that is have anything to do with me. So this role of the poet is somehow to cross over with a language that makes us feel what you just were mentioning, Jane, the universal grief that we all need to feel. So how to keep doing that? Diana, did you have a poem?
Yeah, so moving maybe from universal grief and collective trauma to more personal trauma. And I guess this is good in our chronology of what we're reading, because I think this was maybe May of 2020 when it was written. Watching Thelma and Louise during lockdown with my daughters. Do they get caught? C asks, wanting to know the end from the beginning. Do they make it to Mexico? Do they go to jail? Do they get shot by cops and cruisers and choppers? Just wait, I say. I've already messed up. I forgot the scene in the parking lot, the predator at the honky-tonk bar slapping Thelma in the face, shoving her belly down on the hood of his truck, the click of his belt unbuckling. It was 1991. I hadn't been raped yet. I kept the thrill of the open road, Brad Pitt strutting in cowboy jeans, Louise fierce and bold in her gritty bandana, blowing up an 18-wheeler. That was power, I thought back then. Do they make it? C asks again. She says the women are stupid. They should switch cars, hop a train, stop calling home to Arkansas. She is sure she could survive if given the chance. A is quiet. Oh, I know, she breathes softly as they near the Grand Canyon. At the end, the green car floats above the earth. Tears trace my cheeks and I take the girls' hands. Thelma and Louise are holding hands too. This is the only way, I try to explain. They have no choice, not in this world. It's the movies after all. The Thunderbirds suspended forever in Arizona sky, a magic feminist ride to the afterlife, while we're stuck here on the ground, on the couch, in the house, where it's dark, dark, dark all around. The future pressed hard against the windows.
Wonderful, Diana. Is that a new poem? That's terrific.
I mean.
Oh, that's right. It's yeah.
May 2020.
Right. Sorry, I remember.
Right, during the
it sounds very
lockdown.
new. It sounds very new. Yeah. Thank you, Shanta. How about you? You've got one?
Yeah. This is dealing with a different kind of, I would say, historical trauma, historical into the current. Coda, origin story. Stealing sprouts intimacy, foundation laid for contagion. I am devoured. I am thirst unquenched. Coordinates lost to mamas. I've memorized every room in your house. I built the blueprints. I am mitochondrial Eve, squat wide and gaze death. And I am the child retracing buried placenta. I am sister to Atunda, he who broke and birthed gods. I knew you were coming. Through tongue, through eyes, through ears, I entered. Through pores of skin, I am your interior. You're forever eternal. You saw, you opened wide, because you knew you'd become. I won't travel you ragged, won't twist and tear your tongue. Give me your children. I'm taking your children. Your appetite grooms me, grew me up. That hunger, thirst, lust, want, and there is no language, no alphabet contains what I'ma do to you.
Thank you, Shanta. Is that in your second book?
Yes.
Okay, that's going to come out. Thank you very much. Wonderful. Maybe I'll read a quick one also. This came out I wrote in March of 2020. Also, that's exactly, Vijay, when my book came out, In My Unknowing, or Jane, you were mentioning that. We've had to deal with the question of how to think about poetry, read poetry, promote our work, but just as we've all been saying, how to listen. I heard this voice in March, even in April. There was an article in Der Spiegel about so many people dying without being able to say goodbye to their loved ones. He died alone and he will be buried alone. So I took that for the epigraph of this poem, Love's Last Goodbye in the Time of COVID. And it's written from the perspective of a patient who's died of COVID and is speaking to his beloved from the other world. The darkness arrived without your voice or touch, and yet I heard your voice and felt your hand in mine. Nothing in the end, not even death, can loose my grip from yours. What can I say that echoes here and beyond? Just this. You were always so contagious, dear, my hazelnut, my vast. But unlike this germ, you infected me with a love that made me better than well, and was a gift of bliss I didn't deserve. So take these words that are not mine, but the ones you gave me in the silence of this room, and I return. You were there, I tell you, you were there when I was crossing from there to here. And you are here as well right now. No absence, yours or mine, can fill itself with itself anywhere when two have loved as we did love, if only for a time. Well, we have about 2 or 3 minutes. Would anybody like to provide some closing remarks about this? Where do we go from here? Where do you see yourself going from this point on? I mean, it's, you know, we haven't returned at all to normal, although some of us think we have. But where do you see the country and the world going from this point onward, as far as what we've all been experiencing from this this plague? Anybody want to answer that first?
It's a big question, Chard.
I know.
Good question. I keep thinking back to, as you asked that question, I was thinking back to my horror as I was like finishing my last residency, the January 6th insurrection, and thinking, I need to break out of America. How am I going to get out of America? Like, so I'm like, I don't know if I have an answer to that big question.
Well, the question really is, you know, how do we envision our future? Yeah, not just as writers, but as citizens, as people, and after going through what we've been going through. And it just may be a succinct initial response, what comes sort of most immediately to mind.
What comes most immediately to mind? What comes most immediately to mind for me is, you know, I think it was Dr. Johnson who said, "The thought of hanging wonderfully concentrates the mind."
That's right.
Right. So that, you know,
Yeah.
like you feel like death is out there stalking you.
Yes.
You know? You suddenly become much more serious. Whether that kind of is transposed onto the national level is something that is, you know, remains to be assessed or understood. I mean, you kind of feel like the country as a whole has not learned any lessons at all.
I know.
You know,
yeah.
That, you know, in fact, it's just confirmed its deepest psychoses in some way. And that's like very disturbing. I don't know how we're going to respond to that. I don't think the left has a response. You know, the right
just acknowledging that, Vijay, I think is so important. Yeah.
I will also say that I live in a state of continual bewilderment and perplexity. And no matter how much we examine and try to understand how did we get here, the important question is the one that you asked, that you raise, which is how do we go on from here? How do
Right.
we repair the world?
Mhm.
And, you know, just this morning, when I woke up, I was thinking, so Shanta raised the word earlier and said it was a taboo, rage. And
Mm.
I know for myself, as I have felt my responses to what we have all been asked to witness in so many dimensions these last 18 months, you know, the phrase that I was looking at this morning was rage and tenderness. And
Mm.
how can rage and tenderness live inside one body and spirit, and each of them do their appropriate work?
That's really so well put succinctly, Jane. Thank you, Jane. I mean, let's see,
Yeah.
Diana.
I feel like there's something that's happened in me personally, but I am seeing this like in a larger phenomenon, this sense of the poet as truth teller. And I think there was a cultural moment at the inauguration with Amanda Gorman and her poem, and the kind of resonance that had for a lot of people. I think she had a line like, even as we grieved, we grew. And so I don't want to be any kind of just, you know, silver lining or some optimist, because I do feel full of rage and bewildered and at times in despair. And yet I do feel like there's something that we are seeing where voices are coming forward, voices of poets and writers, and those that we might not have heard before, that this young woman got on the national stage and people listened, and her book became a bestseller. I mean, I don't think that was a flash in the pan. I really don't. I know there were people who, you know, did an MFA critique of her poem, but I don't think that's worthwhile. And I did feel intensely hopeful through that period of time right then. And maybe it's the sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back dance. I don't know.
Thanks, Dana. I felt the same way. Shanta, do you have anything to say pretty quickly? Our time here is pressing on us a little bit.
Absolutely. I would say, again, as it becomes more disturbing that we're not listening to each other, like, try to bear witness, listen, and practice radical self-care.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you. This has been a really moving and enlightening discussion, and I hope people will go back to the recording of it and listen to everybody speaking again here about this. So I wish you all well, good health, safety, and meaningful action in writing. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye. And
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye, everyone.